Hi, David here with Independence Live. We're in a hut. We're in Carbeth. We have Lesley Riddoch with us. Lesley, how are you doing?
I'm fine. I was going to say I'm chilling, but I'm not. Toasty.
We've got this lovely roasting fire.
Yeah.
So, we're in a hut, and huts are a thing. I used to go hutting when I was a child myself. How's the 1,000 Huts campaign getting on?
Well, it's actually coming on surprisingly well. To put this whole thing in context, I've been doing a PhD comparing huts in Scotland and Norway. Right, huts, PhDs are always a bit weird. And this one is because really this is an aspect of land ownership, I think. Scotland is weird at its latitude. Everybody else has an active hut tradition. You know, particularly Norway, they have the highest proportion of huts per person in the world. And you stand between a Norwegian and their car at 3:30 on a Friday, you're flattened, because that's what people live for, is getting out of cities. And their version of a summer holiday, it's not our puny little 2 weeks away in the sun somewhere, it's 2 months away in their hut. You know, it's that big a part of people's lives. And that's pretty normal across the whole Nordics. But the way that things have come in Scotland, totally different. Here's a statistic. The Norwegians have 368,000 wooden huts like this. We have 600. They have fewer people than us. So what's up with us? And what I've been finding in the research is that there were lots of places like Carbeth set up between the wars by our grandparents who managed to find little chinks in all the armoury of land ownership where they could manage to get just a few huts here and there, just the same as people across the whole of Europe. But unlike everybody else, they ended up getting evicted, getting their sites turned into caravan sites to be sort of prettified or gentrified, or just finding so many difficulties they were evicted. And that's still happening. 2-3 years ago, 60 people in Barry Downs in Angus were evicted. Those huts have been there since 1937. And this is part of our heritage. It's our history. And it's still getting lost. So the 1,000 Huts campaign here was trying to put the show back on the road, trying to say this is what people like to do to be able to relax with their friends and their family. And it's doing quite well now because we've managed to get a hut designated in council planning terms, which didn't exist before. We've got a site in Fife which will have 10 glorious huts put on it as a pilot. But if that works, we'll get more. And there's hundreds of people already signed up wanting huts.
Okay. Is there a political appetite to support this use of land for public good?
Well, yes and no. I mean, I think private landowners are very wary because if you look at it, I was at a meeting just recently, and for example, the average tenancy at the moment in any kind of normal house is 6 months. It's scandalous. You know, the normal these days is that you don't even know your kids going to the same school next year. That's the average length of a tenancy in Britain at the moment. So what you need, however, for a hut is generally a 20-year lease, because otherwise, how would you put the energy into it to create all this when you could effectively just have your lease not repeated next year? So that's not, it takes a lot of changes in the mindset really of private landowners to want somebody on their land for 20 years. So that's why we've gone for Forestry Commission for starters, because they are one of the biggest landowners in Scotland in our name.
Yes.
So, you know, Scots want, I think, the same sort of use of forests as there are, again, in most of the Nordic countries, the Low Countries in Germany, which is forests are for people. They're not just cellulose factories, which is what we've let them become here.
It's strongly linked to the land reform.
I think it is. Yeah. Because, you know, I mean, in the book that I wrote, there's quite a chunk in there because people can talk about land reform in the abstract. And I'll tell you, somebody who's the, daughter of a Caithness lass whose family was all evicted and cleared originally in Caithness, I can get hot and bothered enough about the statistics without anything else. But I think for a lot of people, they haven't figured what that does to us to not have access to land. We are so disconnected from nature. We're like troglodytes. You know, we're walled up inside a city identity so much of the time. And there's a lot of folk I know who, if you were to say to them, would you like, you know, a hut or something, they actually are scared of the countryside because they don't know what to do in it. In fact, you could go further than that and say they think it is the belonging of the toffs. They think actually the city is where they're safe because you can understand how a city works, its dynamics. Whereas the country is for the upper classes, the hunting, shooting, fishing brigade. You can't touch the river, you can't touch the hill, you can't touch a deer, you can't touch anything because it's there, but it's not something to access.
Is this quite exclusive to the Scottish mentality? I mean, do you see this in Ireland or in the Scandinavian areas?
No. I mean, we're weird.
Yeah.
And this is something that's important to get because if you don't get outside your own situation, you just go for shades of grey on it to try and resolve problems. You know, a wee bit more access, a few more community buyouts will sort it. No, this is ridiculous. We've got 540 people who own half of Scotland. It's weird, you know, it's beyond weird. We have rivers there, which if you touch them, you could effectively be arrested by water bailiffs, which are time-shared into the next century. You go to Norway and you go to similar sorts of rivers and you find that locals can have a permit to fish some of the best salmon fishing rivers in Norway for 50 quid a year. Here you can't even touch it unless you're a friend of those and such as those. So we're well out of sync with what people do in other countries, which is they put their people first with leisure. And the problem, I think, for Scotland is that politics has been very bound up with the working agenda. You know, we've talked a lot about full-time male employment. That's been the benchmark of success for the labour movement for a century. Other movements, and to be fair, our own history used to be a much wider one, where health was important, leisure was important. I mean, you live for what you do outside the work. But we lost all that. We became a very materialist kind of culture, both in terms of you know, Labour and Tories. So we need to get back to what makes the heart tick, you know, what makes the spring in the step, because that's politics too. Yeah.
So tell us about the work that you've been doing in your PhD.
Well, you don't want too much of that because actually it's too early in the day to be falling asleep, but some of it is what I've been saying to you. Some of the stuff that's shocking in Scotland is actually the way that, for example, Carbeth began. It began by a couple of guys who were sergeants, actually, in the Highland Cycling Battalion, which I didn't even know existed, who were stationed in Ireland, who had saved all the way through the war to get a total of something like £30 through, and they'd managed to survive the war by that stage for about 3 years, about 3 or 4 of them. And they wrote effectively to the old owner of this place and said the only thing that was keeping them going was the prospect of jointly being able to finance having a hut to come to when the war was over. And he knocked them back. He knocked them back, and the letter that I got, which took some finding, showed that he had knocked them back because neighbours had suggested that they were Bolsheviks. This was around the time of the general strike. This was rent strikes organised by the women of Glasgow. This was the time of the Russian Revolution. This was a time that all the landed classes were really worried about what was going to happen next. And to have the toehold of guys like that, any guys from working class areas in Glasgow, that was too scary. But the guys persevered, and the result is what's around us today. So, I mean, this really is part of our working heritage, and we should know far more about it.
Definitely. I think what's interesting, we have neighbours right across the water from us. Unlike the French, they speak perfect English. So why is it that we have people in Denmark and Sweden, and particularly Norway, who we don't talk to? What's going on there?
Yeah, well, that I think what's happened is that since 1707, and it's been said by many people, the outlook of Scotland changed from looking east, which was our traditional trading ports and so on, to looking west, following the lines of expansion of the empire and the preoccupation with the Americas. And we've bought into that whole thing for a very long time. So actually most of our politics is that way. It's an emotional link as well, because after the clearances, we often look at the places that our blood has gone, if you like. And so we identify with the Canadians, the Australians, whatever else. Actually, we don't seem to identify with what's in our interests, you know, not what we find interesting, but but what would be in the self-interest of a bunch of 5 million people in the North Atlantic.
Indeed.
Presumably, it would be the success of a bunch of 5 million other people in the North Atlantic who are doing very well. So you're right, now that there's no language barrier, I spent 3 years learning Norwegian to have no opportunity to use it whatsoever.
Okay.
Because I can never find anybody whose Norwegian is worse than my... Sorry, the other way around. Their English is worse than my Norwegian.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's an interesting aspect of the... We had a referendum campaign, if anybody didn't notice, but some of the things that we were discussing were to do with parallels, to do with Finland and Norway and Sweden, etc. And yet there were so many people who just didn't understand how normal it was for those countries to operate, and how, in fact, if people, you never hear somebody in Denmark complaining about Denmark. I mean, I spoke to a Swedish girl recently at a music festival, and I think the worst thing she said about Sweden was it was a bit boring. If that's the worst thing you can say about your society, and yet there wasn't an understanding or a feeling that you want to be like that. In Scotland, there was this idea of you've got to be part of something which is really big.
Yeah.
Not that Britain's even that big.
Well,
it's a strange way of
when
thinking.
it comes to it, if you start to look at it, the AAA credit-rated nations, if that matters to anybody, the countries that are deemed by the big brokers of the world to be good for it, good for repayments, are all small countries or all the properly federal countries. And that seems to me to say something.
Yeah.
Our neighbours have been doing very well, some of them with no resource whatsoever. When Norway became independent in 1905, it had nothing. It was the second poorest country in Europe. The Icelanders should be dead. God love them. They are crazy.
Yeah.
But, there's 250,000 of them basically stuck on a rock on which a third of all the lava flows on Earth have flowed.
Yeah.
At the middle of 2 tectonic plates. And they don't want to go back to be, under anybody else's control. And in a way, the longer I looked at the Nordics and their incredible resilience, I mean, their crazy need to be able to run their own affairs to the degree that, like the Icelanders, you might think sometimes it is almost barking. It is not like us. We are, if you like, we're a bit behind because a lot of these countries had a long period of Devo Max. The Norwegians, for example, were running themselves pretty well from 1814 when they got their they wrote their own constitution till 1905, almost a century of basically raising their own taxes and having only foreign affairs in common with the Swedes. And that was true for a while with all the other countries. They had much more time running themselves. We had a run for the line. We had, 20 years with actually no real tax-raising powers. It's not easy in that length of time to undo the habit of top-downness that we've had for centuries. They never had it. They've always been locally controlled societies where the cash stayed in the municipalities, and Norway never had feudalism. It has the most widespread land ownership practically in the world. So we look similar, but actually the way our societies have evolved is completely different. We're top-down and with a thin democracy, and theirs is a very vital grassroots, cooperatively owned one.
And I think that's one of the visions that we had for a new independent Scotland, which we believe will still come, was that it's more a local politics, which communities actually work for each other and for themselves, and they can see the problems and identify solutions to problems and work together towards that, as opposed to waiting for a central form of government to come down and impose. I mean, do they look at us and think, what are they doing? Why did they vote no? I mean, why did they organise themselves in that way?
There's a whole variety of stuff. I mean, some of them, I was in Finland just before the vote, and someone came up to me and said, "Are you Scottish?" And I said, "Yeah." And they said, "You see, if you go for independence, do you guys get most of the oil?" I said, "Aye, 90%. And she said, "Do?" And I mean, that is a large part of it, which is if you have that amount of asset, what the heck are you doing in this union?
Yeah.
But to be honest, a lot of the rest of the reaction is there's a huge fondness for Britain, viz. England, in a lot of the Nordic countries.
Okay.
In Norway in particular, their king actually lived in London during the Second World War when the Germans occupied.
Right.
They import situation comedies. That's the reason their English is so good. That's the reason that John Cleese did his retirement tour in Norway. He's huge because they all learned English watching Fawlty Towers and Monty Python. I've sat in the middle of nowhere in Finnmark, which is in the very north of Norway, doing the argument sketch from Monty Python with a complete stranger. Now, that is all English. They have a huge fondness for England. And because we're not a nation, they don't have a clear conception of Scotland at all. They don't know how we're different. They know we've got whisky. The Swedes very much know we've got whisky because they're very much more into the whisky business. But nobody can see clearly enough what the society difference is like.
Is this our problem? Is this us not projecting ourselves into the world correctly?
Well, it is, but on the other hand, how much knowledge is any one set of people supposed to have? I mean, the Nordics are flanked by lots of wannabe regions that aren't quite, or nations that aren't quite states. They've got all the Hanseatic areas around Germany, all the low country, the areas of Germany, the Länder, which all have more power than us and are much more relevant for them. Why on earth should they know more about Scotland? You need to get out of this place a while to see that the world is full of far more successfully devolved areas than us. And we're not unusual. The only bit of foo-foo dust we got now is the 84%, the 45%, the fact we nearly, it's a bit like the football last night, we nearly beat the guys that beat the world champions, So that's not enough to get profile on the international stage.
Yeah. And another aspect of Scandinavian society, perhaps, is Sweden was the England of Scandinavia in its own way, but there isn't an animosity between the nations of Scandinavia and Sweden.
No. I mean, there's a lot of kind of low-key rivalry for sure,
There are jokes.
Yes, there's jokes. And actually, the Swedes probably think the Danes were the England of the piece originally because the Danes ran the whole shooting match. But you're quite right, Sweden was the powerhouse. And it gores them great now that they can cross the border and their own Swedish krona are worth less than the Norwegian krona because they used to think they were the peasants. I'll tell you, it works very smugly the other way. But you're right, in general terms, everyone's got over it. There's all sorts of joint cooperation. You easily cross borders without knowing you're doing it. There's a shared travel area. There's Nordefco, which is the Nordic Defence Cooperation Union, which brings in Iceland as well, which is ambitious given that, trying to kind of share everything here is fine, but then trying to ship stuff out to Iceland is quite a haul. There's shared scientific research. There's shared research into the Nordic model, which is the high welfare standards that all of them share in common. There's all sorts of funding that you can only get if you're one of the Nordic countries or the developed world, because all of them have got a massive commitment to developing countries. That's part of their not having an aggressive security policy. Most of their security policy, or their defence policy, if you like, is anti-poverty work in the third world. So, it's a very different feel when you're there.
Do you think that, if Scottish people actually understood what you've just explained there, if this was a common knowledge amongst Scottish people, we would be sitting here talking about not winning a referendum? No, because seeing is believing. The reason I can sit and tell you all of this is because I've been there now, I can't remember how many times, in all the different countries. I've been welcomed into people's homes, all the little things where you notice how ungrabby people are, how relaxed they are, how you go and speak to endless numbers of shop assistants and keep thinking they must be students on holiday because they're so well educated. They're not. That's their jobs, but they get paid twice, 3 times our minimum wage rates. It takes a long time for all that to seep into your consciousness, and finally you think to yourself, I get it. I really get it. This is what life is like when you put equality at the centre of a rich society. Now, I could be telling you this, and some people are smart enough in life to pick things up from statistics or from stories that other people tell, but most people need to see things to believe them. And we have no traffic going between us because it's kind of expensive to buy a pint. That's the only thing that people basically know about Scandinavia. That is what I was going to come to there, was the price of a pint is the one thing that people come up with when they talk about Scandinavia. And yet, I believe it's actually relatively cheaper for a Norwegian person to buy themselves a pint than it would be for us to buy a pint in our own country. But that's right. It's one of these things that people just go in and measure the whole of society on the basis of how much a pint costs. I mean, only the Scots. But the point is, does that not make people also think, right, so if it's not actually so expensive for these guys, then that means they're paid higher wages. Yes. That means they have higher consumption. That means there's higher demand for local products. That means that there's more employment. That means people pay more taxes. That means there's more income for welfare. That means welfare is excellent. That means middle-class people use public welfare services. That increases social solidarity. That means they're willing to pay their taxes. Round and round that virtuous circle goes, in the same way as our vicious circle works in exactly the opposite way. Daylight occurs when you're standing there and you begin to use some of the stuff,
and you realise how this could operate. But I don't think that just words are enough. We need more contacts, and that's why the group that I've set up 4 years ago, Nordic Horizons, keeps bringing people over to talk, and now is bringing people back in the opposite direction to see.
Okay. Can you tell us a little bit more about Nordic Horizons?
Yeah, well, it was set up 4 or 5 years ago. Brings over specialists to talk on all sorts of different areas. We've had people speaking about the outdoor kindergartens of Norway, the welfare policy of Denmark, the excellent old folks care of Sweden, which is actually the highest quality old folks care in the world.
Yeah.
The fact that the Finns have got the highest rated educational system in the world, which is very related to equality. That's what they say. If they get more equality in society, they're working with kids who've got a chance, who've got a hope, and funnily enough, they get better educational results.
Yeah.
So we've had them in the Scottish Parliament talking to MSPs, researchers, the public, meeting civil servants, meeting council chiefs. My hope is that people just telling their own stories, not with any particular angle or anything, but just as it is, that begins to make an impact on people who are making decisions about policy now in Scotland.
Okay. And there was a very, it's now quite a famous book that was called The Spirit Level. And again, it's the same principles of the difference between rich and poor in a society, the less of the bad things, alcoholism, etc., drug abuse, are not quite as severe as they are when you have a large difference between rich and poor. And you don't have that difference between rich and poor in Scandinavia anywhere, I don't think.
No. I mean, there's obviously, there's shades of grey once you begin to notice, the terrain for a while. Yeah. But I remember being in Sweden beside the largest rubbish dump in Europe, which is at a place, Helsingborg, and the Swedes recycle heavily. Only 80% of their stuff is recycled, only 20% goes to incinerators to produce district heating at discounted rates for local people. Again, dough. So I was standing at the edge of this massive, massive dump. It went on for miles, and there's all sorts of different gradations of rubbish. And the guy standing beside me, first of all, said, breathe in, smell that. Can you smell anything? And I said, no, I can't. He said, that took us 3 years to get rid of the smell. And Henrik Larsson lives a mile down the road. We use Henrik as a marker.
Really?
We ask, Henrik, can you smell anything? When he can't, we're all laughing, right? So that was the first thing that was kind of quite impressive about his attitude. But the other thing about it was that it started raining and I was interviewing the guy, and suddenly an umbrella appeared from nowhere. A woman was holding it, very thoughtful, because we just went on talking. And at the end of it, I turned to thank her. And the interviewee said, can I introduce you to the mayor of Helsingborg? This was the mayor that had stood with the umbrella over us. Now, this is something to do with the flatness of Swedish society in particular. You don't get, when I've been in universities, professors, like everyone else, clear their plates together. They don't leave it on the tray for some other worker to come and clear. That's unthinkably snotty. Yeah. So you see it all the time, that basically there's just not such a gap in behaviour, in income, or in outlook or aspiration between all the sorts of people you meet in a day. And that's fabulous. I can't tell you what a relief, maybe too much Protestant guilt in my life. I feel guilty having things when other people don't have things. It's not fun in the end. And you finally get the release that you've always wanted, because you can have something nice because she's got something nice. And those folk have got something nice. In fact, they've got nicer stuff than us. They've got huts. So, actually it's a very relieving thing to be in a society like that. It not only can work, it works.
It does work, so a much healthier value system as well.
Yeah.
Okay, so you've taken a role now with Bella Caledonia.
Yes.
Yeah, can you tell us more about that?
Only a little, because it's very recent. Okay. Mike Small took a bit of time off, stood back from the thing after doing a bit of crowdsourcing, and began to see that, in fact, it needed editorial boards in a whole series of areas to strengthen the journalism and strengthen the ideas. So he's divvied it up. My little area, which I'm one of the board members of, is community. Okay. And that's great, because we'll meet. I met Douglas Robertson recently, who's a housing lecturer at Stirling University. And we're talking about how to get together and get whole lots of different kinds of journalism into the online paper, magazine, whatever you like to call it. Yeah. And that's brilliant, because these are all society, green issues, food issues, community issues. These are not the classic divisions of a newspaper as you know it. And thank God for that, because they're now going to the real areas that people absolutely live in. Yeah. So all part of Mike's elbow.
Definitely. I mean, it seems that politics is the way it was traditionally structured as well as the media. It's very much a sort of southern gaze, very much a London agenda. For example, Green politics never very well represented in Scotland, and yet Green politics probably more relevant to Scotland than anywhere else in the UK. But we're now building a new media infrastructure, and I say new media as opposed to mainstream. Do you think that on the run-up to the referendum, were we actually ready for what came about? I mean, we seem to be crushed by the mainstream media using its the London government agenda was pumped through the mainstream media, and it basically permeated right through the whole of Scottish society. But we're trying to catch up with the new media. Were we ready for it?
Well, there's a couple of things. There's not many countries in which its citizenry are more up and at it in terms of media than us.
Yeah.
So if you're to look at it in comparative terms, I don't think everybody else would have forged their own media first. We're in a pretty unprecedented situation. In terms of the establishment agenda, it's an establishment agenda, I think. It's not necessarily, of course, it currently is a British government agenda. If the Greens took over the British government, it wouldn't be a British government agenda. It's an establishment agenda. Okay. It's a lazy default, which is part of the reason I left, which is unimaginative and uncreative as well as everything else. I've never been in a conversation which said stitch up the SNP or ditch the independence guy. It was one that said, David Cameron's done something today. Okay. What is it? That's the problem. It's that always the authority sources are the people who make news, and it's impossible for people who think like that to consider this news, or to consider 1,000 people outside the BBC News, or to consider a widespread movement a little everywhere that wants huts as news. So it's all these things that are difficult for the classic mainstream media to get their heads round. In terms of alternatives, I feel a couple of things, and we might disagree here. I don't think it's good now to have whatever emerges as having yes, freedom, or even independence in the title. Because for me, as a journalist and as an active broadcaster I have always wanted an alternative media in Scotland. I set up Harpies and Quines in 1991, a feminist magazine. Nae a snifter of referendums then, right?
Okay.
There's not enough alternatives in Scotland, even if you park the referendum. And I think a lot of people, me here anyway, I'm as unhappy with a script of any kind that means I kind of question stuff as I would be in the BBC, which is why I left. I think we just want an alternative media that is alert, alive, and takes its inspiration from what moves people.
Okay. Well, we've got Bella Caledonia coming together. It's been various new contributors have been established. I think Derek Bateman's teaming up with Newsnet Scotland.
Newsnet Scotland, everybody.
Newsnet
in case
Scotland.
You misheard that.
Newsnet
I had
Scotland.
a minor heart attack.
How do you think the overall new media infrastructure is coming together? Do you think we've now actually got something which can stand up against the mainstream media?
We have, but here's the thing. Yeah. If the alternative media, as it worked, was punching on all cylinders, and let's say doing the Heineken test, which is reaching the parts that everybody else can't reach, we wouldn't have had a no vote. That's a bit simplistic, actually, because actually there's lots of components of how that worked. But I mean, all the evidence showed that the more someone was engaged, and that is mostly with social media, because after all, there was little to engage with in the mainstream media, despite the best efforts of people like myself, then they tended to become more yes-oriented. So the difficulty, I think, is that we're still sitting going round in a wee circle over here. And I meet people all the time who have never heard of Bella Caledonia, the smart thinking people who don't use Twitter, in their 20s. What the... so there's kind of, I think it needs something that's kind of got a certain mainstream appeal to try to appeal to people who think they are part of a mainstream. And I deeply resent paying a licence fee to not get the goodies out of the BBC. So a lot of this to me is wanting to, I think 1,000 flowers can blossom, because I think there needs to be stuff that is quick and motivated by what moves all you guys here, which is still the Independence Live thing. That's great. There can be something else that's a bit more mainstream. That's cool too. But in the end, I'm fed up building too many parallel structures in this country. I want control of the BBC. Not me personally, I hasten to add, but I want that back under some vestige of representing what people in Scotland want.
Yeah.
I'm not happy with that situation being sidestepped by the creativity and energy of us constantly doing our dinger to supply what is not part of our mainstream diet.
Do you think it's possible under the Devomax discussions that broadcasting could be devolved?
It could be, but there's still a problem there, because if any, let's say, SNP government gets that power and uses it to whack the BBC over the head in Scotland, that looks very like sour grapes. That looks like, we blamed you guys for losing the referendum for us, whack, we're going to start trying to control you. This is always the problem with broadcasters, with trying to control them, because it looks very bad. And trying to micromanage broadcasting, bad idea. This needs a regrounding, basically, with somebody able to make different appointments about who is managing, or to change some of the criteria. Actually, some of them are not too bad, but we need to get back a little bit as to what the BBC thinks its role is in Scotland. And that's no easy task. And I suspect, in the same way as we currently have, the BBC Scotland bosses went to the Holyrood Media and Culture Committee, and actually, on a lot of those occasions, the MSPs in that pulled their punches, big time. And I spoke to some of them, and it's just because they can't touch the BBC without getting the accusation that they're bullying the media. So it's not an easy one.
Lesley Riddoch, it's been lovely talking to you. Thanks very much.
Right, Jar. Nice to speak to you.
And thanks very much for watching. Please stay tuned for more.